The hospice always smelled like lavender and sharp antiseptic, a heavy combination that never quite masked the underlying scent of fading time. It was exactly 2 in the early morning. My eyes burned from 3 days of broken sleep, and my lower back ached from the stiff vinyl chair beside my brother's bed. I stepped out into the quiet hallway, desperate for a cup of stale coffee from the machine down the hall. The corridor was dim, lit only by the pale blue glow of the emergency exit signs. That was when I saw her. Mrs. Higgins sat in her wheelchair right in the center of the hallway, a thick wool blanket draped over her knees. She was staring straight ahead into the darkness. I slowed my steps, not wanting to startle her. She turned her head slowly, her pale eyes catching the faint light. She did not look confused at all. She looked entirely awake, and she looked directly at me. She lifted a trembling finger and gestured for me to come closer. I walked over and crouched beside her chair. She smelled faintly like peppermint and old paper. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a blade. She told me that whatever my nephew David said when he arrived the next afternoon, I must not believe a single word of it. She told me to drive home that night if I could. She told me to protect my brother's final wishes. A sudden, cold spike of dread moved down my spine. The hallway suddenly felt very large and very empty. I thanked her quietly, stood up, and walked back to my brother's room. I told myself she was just a tired, frightened old woman projecting her own family regrets onto mine. I dismissed her warning as the rambling of a confused mind. But as I sat back down in the dark beside my sleeping brother, her exact words echoed in my head, planting a seed of doubt that would change everything. I have always been a man who measures twice before cutting once. At 64, my life is built on routines that keep the world from spinning too fast. I balance my ledger every Sunday evening. I read the terms and conditions on every contract. I notice when the milk carton feels heavier than it should be, and I notice when a conversation feels rehearsed. That careful nature is what kept me grounded through decades of quiet work, but it is also what makes me so fiercely loyal to the few people I truly trust. Chief among them was my older brother, Thomas. He was 4 years ahead of me, and when our parents left us with nothing but a mortgage and a stack of unpaid bills, Thomas became both father and anchor. He taught me how to tie a Windsor knot, how to negotiate a fair price for a used sedan, and how to look a man directly in the eye when making a promise. He never raised his voice, never demanded gratitude, and never asked for anything in return. When the hospice nurse called to say his time was short, I did not pack a suitcase. I packed 3 shirts, a worn leather journal, and the quiet determination to sit beside him until the very end. I expected grief. I expected silence. I did not expect David. My nephew arrived precisely at 11 in the morning, stepping through the glass doors with the confident stride of a man who believes the world bends to his schedule. He wore a charcoal wool coat that looked freshly pressed, and the air around him carried the sharp, expensive scent of roasted coffee beans and cedar cologne. He embraced me before he even glanced toward the room where his father lay breathing shallowly. His arms wrapped around my shoulders, firm and lingering, holding on for a beat longer than comfort allowed. I felt the tension in his frame, not from sorrow, but from calculation. When we finally entered the room, David moved to the bedside with practiced grace. He took Thomas's thin hand in his own, bowing his head as if in prayer. But my eyes caught what others might easily miss. His thumb tapped a restless rhythm against the mattress. His gaze flicked to the wall clock, then back to his phone screen, which remained face down in his pocket. He spoke softly about legacy, about handling the transition smoothly, about making sure the paperwork was settled before the inevitable. His words were polished, designed to soothe and reassure. Yet beneath the velvet tone, I sensed a quiet urgency, a need to accelerate timelines that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with logistics. I watched him adjust the blanket, pour a glass of water, and memorize the nurse's name, all while his mind clearly tracked something far beyond this room. I told myself I was being unfair. Hospice changes people. Stress fractures even the steadiest nerves. David was simply trying to be efficient, trying to carry the weight of arrangements while his heart was breaking. That is what I repeated to myself as I sat in the corner, observing the careful choreography of his concern. I pushed down the cold whisper in my chest, the instinct that warned me something was misaligned. He is just overwhelmed, I quietly thought. He is doing his best. I knew how money could quietly reshape loyalties, turning careful plans into hurried signatures. I had seen it happen to friends who trusted the wrong hands. That knowledge sat heavy in my chest. But as the afternoon light stretched across the linoleum floor, I could not shake the feeling that I was no longer watching a grieving son. I was watching a man who had already moved past mourning and straight into acquisition. The seed of doubt Mrs. Higgins planted lingered in the quiet air. It was a steady alarm, ringing beneath my polite silence. The shift did not happen all at once. It arrived in quiet, almost invisible increments. Within 48 hours of his arrival, David had seamlessly inserted himself into every facet of my brother's care. He began by helping with the small things. He adjusted the thermostat, changed the Wi-Fi password, reorganized the bedside table, and politely redirected the nurses when they asked me for updates. He told the head nurse that I looked exhausted and needed to rest, gently suggesting that I take long walks or sleep in the guest room down the hall. It sounded like kindness. It sounded like concern. But I soon realized it was a subtle form of isolation. When I returned from a brief walk, I found my brother's personal phone missing from the nightstand. When I asked David about it, he smiled his practiced, reassuring smile and said he had taken it to the front desk for safekeeping because the constant notifications were disturbing my brother's rest. I nodded, but a cold knot tightened in my stomach. Thomas was a man who checked his weather app every morning. Taking his phone was not about peace, it was about severing his connection to the outside world. As the days blurred together, David began to speak for Thomas. When the doctor came in to discuss pain management, David stood at the foot of the bed and answered every question before Thomas could even open his mouth. He used phrases like, "Dad prefers this, and we have decided on that option." Thomas would simply look at me, his eyes wide and glassy, his mouth slightly open as if trying to form a word he could no longer reach. It was a suffocating feeling, watching the man who had raised me being slowly erased from his own life, while everyone else in the room mistook this erasure for devoted care. I thought of the old metaphor about the frog in the boiling water. If you drop a frog into boiling water, it jumps out. But if you place it in cold water and slowly turn up the heat, it will not notice the danger until it is too late. I was that frog. The temperature in that room was rising steadily, and I was letting it happen because I did not want to cause a scene. I kept telling myself that David was just trying to make things easier for his father. But deep down, the warning from the woman in the hallway echoed in my mind. Mrs. Higgins had seen this exact pattern before. She knew that when someone moves this quickly to isolate a vulnerable person, they are not protecting them, they are securing an asset. That realization shifted something fundamental inside me. The grief that had clouded my judgment began to clear, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I stopped taking long walks. I stopped sleeping in the guest room. I stayed in the vinyl chair, watching. I started observing the mail that arrived at the house. David had insisted on collecting it, claiming he did not want my brother to be stressed by bills. I noticed that the envelopes from the bank and the brokerage firm were noticeably thinner than usual. I also paid close attention to his digital habits. He kept his laptop closed when I entered the room, angling the screen away from my line of sight. He took phone calls in the hallway, his voice dropping to a low, urgent murmur that stopped the moment I stepped out of my brother's room. I knew I needed proof. I needed to see what he was actually doing behind that polished, caring facade. One afternoon, while David was in the cafeteria getting lunch, I walked over to his leather briefcase, which he had carelessly left on the small table near the window. He had unzipped the main compartment just enough for a folded piece of paper to peek out. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for it. I pulled out a printed bank statement. I scanned the routing numbers and the recent transaction history. The numbers did not lie. Large, unexplained transfers had been moved from Thomas's primary savings account into a newly opened joint account over the last 3 weeks. I stared at the paper, the letters blurring slightly as my heart hammered against my ribs. This was not just about controlling the daily routine or managing the household bills. This was a systematic, calculated extraction of my brother's life savings. David was not just isolating Thomas, he was actively dismantling his financial foundation before he even took his final breath. The charming nephew, the grieving son, the helpful caretaker, it was all a meticulously crafted illusion. I carefully folded the bank statement and slipped it into my own pocket. I zipped the briefcase back up exactly as I had found it and returned to my chair. When David returned 10 minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing that same warm, sympathetic smile, I looked at him differently. I no longer saw my brother's son. I saw a stranger who had walked into this room with a hidden agenda. I took the coffee he offered me, thanked him quietly, and took a slow sip. I kept my face completely neutral, giving away absolutely nothing. But inside, the quiet suspicion had fully transformed into a cold, active investigation. I knew now what I was dealing with. I knew the stakes. And as I sat there listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor, I made a silent promise to myself and to my brother. I would not let him leave this world without his dignity, and I would not let his life's work be stolen by the very person he had trusted to protect it. The time for polite observation was over. It was time to take control. The afternoon sun cast long, pale shadows across the hospice room when the notary arrived. He was a polite man in a crisp brown suit, carrying a leather briefcase and projecting the calm efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. David greeted him with a warm handshake and a practiced smile, immediately guiding him toward the small folding tray set up over my brother's bed. Thomas was awake, though his eyes were heavy and unfocused, drifting in and out of a medication-induced haze. David leaned over him, his voice dropping to a soothing, urgent whisper, explaining that this was just a simple transfer to keep things organized, a quick signature to save the family from months of legal headaches. He held a pen near his father's trembling hand, gently guiding the paper forward. The air in the room felt suddenly thick, charged with a quiet desperation that made my skin prickle. I stood up from my chair in the corner, my movements slow and deliberate. I stepped between David and the bed, placing my hand lightly but firmly over the document. David's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing just enough to reveal the frustration beneath. I told him, in a voice so calm it surprised even me, that I wanted to review the paperwork before anyone signed anything. David tried to laugh it off, suggesting that I was too tired to read legal jargon and that he just needed my signature as a witness. I did not raise my voice. I simply repeated my request, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. The notary, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere, politely handed me the stack of papers. As I looked through them, my stomach dropped. The first page was indeed a property deed, but beneath it lay a sweeping power of attorney granting David sole control over all financial and medical decisions, effective immediately. Below that was a beneficiary change form for a substantial life insurance policy, replacing my niece's name with his own. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. He was not just securing a house, he was attempting to quietly dismantle my brother's entire legacy in a single afternoon. I looked up from the papers, meeting David's gaze directly. I asked him, very quietly, to explain the power of attorney and the insurance change. His charming facade cracked, revealing a cold, defensive edge. He claimed they were just protective measures, standard procedures to avoid probate. I asked him if his sister, my niece Sarah, had agreed to be removed from the life insurance policy. He hesitated, his jaw tightening, and muttered that she was fine with it. I simply did not argue. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket, found Sarah's number, and pressed the speaker button. The ringing echoed loudly in the quiet room. When she answered, her voice bright and confused, I asked her directly if she had authorized the removal of her name from her father's life insurance. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's voice turned sharp and panicked as she demanded to know what was happening. David lunged forward, trying to grab the phone, his face flushed with a sudden, ugly panic. He stammered, trying to explain it away as a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. The notary, watching this unfold with wide eyes, quietly closed his briefcase and stated that he could not proceed under these circumstances. I hung up the phone and looked at my nephew. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the young man I had helped with his college applications, was gone. In his place stood a stranger, calculating and cornered. He snatched the documents from my hands, his hands shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. He muttered something about me ruining everything, about how I was being paranoid and dramatic, before turning on his heel and storming out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in his wake. The notary gave me a sympathetic nod, apologized for the inconvenience, and quietly left the room as well. My tired knees suddenly felt very weak. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the confrontation drained away all at once, leaving me hollow and exhausted. I walked over to the bed and gently took my brother's hand. He was looking at me, a single tear tracking through the deep lines of his face. I squeezed his fingers, telling him it was over, that he was safe. I sat back down in the old vinyl chair, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, knowing that the hardest part of the battle was finally over, but the emotional fallout was only just beginning. Thomas passed away 48 hours after the confrontation, slipping away quietly just before sunrise. Sarah and I were there, holding his hands, surrounded by the soft hum of the oxygen machine. It was a peaceful end, exactly what he deserved. In the days that followed, the heavy, hollow feeling of grief settled deep into my bones. But beneath the sorrow, there was a profound, quiet relief. We had protected his final wishes. We had kept his dignity intact. The quiet house felt like a place of healing peace. The following week, Sarah and I sat in the mahogany-paneled office of Marjorie, my brother's lawyer of 20 years. She pulled up the original, legally binding will. The lakefront cabin was to be sold and the proceeds split evenly between Sarah and David. The life insurance and the remaining savings were designated for Sarah and a local trade school scholarship. The documents David had tried to force through the hospice would have erased all of that. As Marjorie guided us through the financial records we had secured, the true depth of his desperation came to light. David was drowning in unsecured debt. He had accumulated massive losses through high-risk online trading and hidden gambling accounts. He wasn't just trying to secure his inheritance, he was trying to plug a massive financial hole before his creditors came knocking. It was a stark reminder of how quickly financial pressure can distort a moral compass. Marjorie also revealed that David had attempted similar financial maneuvers with two of his father's elderly friends in his hometown. He had used the same charming smiles, the same urgent paperwork, and the same subtle isolation tactics. Because we had documented everything and involved the proper legal channels, David faced severe civil consequences. The court issued a strict restraining order, legally barring him from contacting Sarah, me, or managing any of Thomas's remaining assets. His reputation in his professional circles was quietly but thoroughly dismantled. There were no dramatic courtroom scenes, no shouting matches. Just the cold, methodical grinding of the legal system holding him accountable. I sent him a brief, final email, stating that our relationship was over. He replied with a long message about betrayal and broken families. I read it once, closed my laptop, and never looked back. The sadness of a broken family weighed on my chest, but the peace of knowing we made the right choice brought comfort. A month later, I drove back to the hospice in Boise. The autumn air was crisp, and the trees lining the driveway had turned a brilliant, fiery gold. I had brought a small box of pastries and a handwritten card for Mrs. Higgins. I wanted to look her in the eye and tell her that she had saved my brother's legacy. I walked to the front desk, but the nurse's expression immediately softened with a gentle sadness. She told me that Mrs. Higgins had passed away in her sleep 3 days prior. The hallway where she had warned me in the dark suddenly felt incredibly vast and empty. I sat on a wooden bench near the entrance, the cold wind brushing against my face, and opened the small envelope the nurse handed me. It was a letter, left at the desk specifically for me. I realized then that the truest connections are often forged in the most unexpected moments, and that a single act of courage can echo far beyond its initial intent. Her absence was a heavy loss, but her final gift remained. I carefully unfolded the paper, my hands trembling slightly in the crisp autumn air, ready to read the words of the stranger who had become my greatest ally. I sat on the wooden bench outside the hospice, the crisp autumn wind biting at my cheeks, and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, the handwriting thin and slanted. Mrs. Higgins wrote that she did not know if I had listened to her warning, but she hoped I had. She shared her own story. Her son, Tomlin, had quietly taken everything she owned a decade ago. He took the house, the savings, and the rings her late husband gave her. He never spoke to her again because there was nothing left to take. She explained that she had spent the last 10 years in small apartments, relying on the kindness of strangers. The worst part, she wrote, was not the financial loss. The worst part was that nobody warned her. A sister-in-law knew what was happening but stayed silent, claiming it was not her place. That silence inspired Mrs. Higgins to make a different choice. She decided that if she ever saw something happening to someone else, she would speak up. It would be her place. She hoped I was safe. I sat there for a long time, the thin paper trembling slightly in my cold hands. The tears finally came, not from deep sorrow, but from a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. A dying woman with absolutely nothing left to give had used her final breaths to save a complete stranger. She saved my brother's legacy. She saved my niece's inheritance. She saved me from a lifetime of quiet regret. I want to speak directly to you now. If you are seeing something in your own family that does not look right, that quiet feeling in your gut telling you something is wrong, please trust it. Do not let people convince you that it is none of your business. The cost of saying something and being wrong is just a little awkwardness. The cost of not saying something and being right is the entire life of somebody. If someone is rushing you to sign a paper, slow down. Take it home. Call someone who has nothing to gain. The people who truly love you will wait. The people who do not will not. I have learned that family is not just about blood. Family is the person who tells you the truth when it costs them everything. If you are seeing something wrong in your family, please say something. Thank you for listening. As the soft, melancholic piano music fades out, I hope you remember this. I hope you find the courage to speak up, because your voice might be the only thing standing between someone you love and a terrible mistake.